After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe sank into centuries of darkness, an age of chaos, fragmentation, and fear. No emperor, no legions, no order. Yet in that darkness, one man rose, a Frankish king, Charlemagne, whose name would echo through time. He was born in 742, the son of Pepin the Short, and would one day unite nearly all of Western Europe, from France and Germany to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy. But what made Charlemagne the greatest figure of the early Middle Ages was not only the vastness of his realm, nor the crown of Emperor of the Romans. It was because he achieved what no one had done since Julius Caesar. He built the first superpower army of post-Roman Europe, an army not great merely for its steel or blood, but for its organization, discipline, and faith. A war machine that would bring unity to a divided continent and lay the foundation for every European military power that came after. And from here, we begin our journey to uncover how Charlemagne turned scattered barbarian tribes into the first true military superpower of post-Roman Europe. When Charlemagne was born in the middle of the 8th century, Europe had gone more than 300 years without an empire. Roman roads were overgrown with moss. Once great cities had fallen into ruin, and across the land, hundreds of tribes ruled their own territories, each with its own king, its own language, its own law. Among them were the Franks, ancestors of today's French and Germans. They were fierce warriors, but disorganized. A Frankish army was little more than a gathering of fighters, assembled when war came, and disbanded once the campaign was done. There were no standing forces, no logistics, no discipline. Every man fought with his own weapons, and followed only the instincts of battle. When Charlemagne ascended the throne in 768, he realized that an army like this could never create an empire. If he wished to unite Europe, he would have to turn tribal strength into a structured engine of war. And thus began one of the greatest military reforms of the early Middle Ages. Charlemagne's first step was to place military service under the rule of law. He issued a series of decrees known as the Capitulary, documents that detailed exactly who must serve, what they must provide, and how they must equip themselves. Landowners were required to contribute according to their means. The wealthiest had to supply war horses, armor, and weapons. Lesser men could provide grain, carts, or labor, and the poor could serve in transport, medicine, or repair units. This became the first nationwide mobilization network in post-Roman Europe, a force no longer dependent on mercenaries or noble whim, but on duty and structure. Charlemagne also ended the era of private warfare. Where lords had once marched to battle on their own, now every military campaign required the emperor's sanction. Every banner that rose had to bear the imperial symbol, and every army answered directly to the crown. Through this, Charlemagne transformed the Frankish kingdom from a loose confederation of warlords into a centralized military state governed by law and obedience. In his decrees, Charlemagne emphasized that courage alone does not win wars. Discipline and faith do. He ordered each region to maintain training camps, where soldiers practiced marching, maneuvering, and formation changes to the rhythm of drums and horns, no longer charging blindly into chaos. Each soldier was required to bear standardized equipment: a round shield, a spear, a sword, and a helmet. Their weapons were recorded, inspected, and stored in armories supervised by royal officers. It was the birth of a European arms system, and the earliest form of what we would later call a regular army. But Charlemagne wanted more than soldiers. He wanted men with conviction. Before every march, priests would stand before the troops, blessing their swords and horses with holy water. Each campaign began not only with preparation, but with prayer. Charlemagne believed that faith was the glue that bound his men. A mercenary fights for coin. A believer fights for eternity. And that belief made his army unstoppable. From the scattered ranks of the Frankish tribes, Charlemagne built the first organized military machine of post-Roman Europe. Every lord, every farmer, every craftsman now played a role in the empire's defense. It was a transformation unlike anything since Rome. From a people of warriors, he forged a nation of soldiers, and the machine he created would soon make all of Europe tremble. From scattered tribes, Charlemagne had forged a disciplined military state. But he knew that discipline and organization alone were not enough to conquer a continent. To rule, he needed a force that could move fast, strike hard, and inspire fear. And so, Charlemagne created the beating heart of Europe's first post-Roman superpower army, the heavy cavalry. For centuries, European warfare had relied mainly on light infantry, peasants and foot soldiers armed with axes, spears, or simple bows. But Charlemagne saw what others could not. True power lies in speed and impact. He understood that a foot army was too slow, too fragile, unable to react quickly across the vast lands of Europe. His answer was revolutionary: to make the horse the soul of war. Charlemagne built royal stud farms along the Rhine and the Loire. Every horse was bred for endurance and trained to respond to voice and horn. The strongest breeds from Friesland and Bavaria were crossbred to produce the Frankish war horse, tall, muscular, capable of carrying a fully armored knight and his steel. The men chosen to ride them, the milites, were not mere soldiers, but a new social order, noble warriors. They were granted land to sustain their horses and armor, and in return, they swore to ride whenever their emperor called. From these men arose the first knights of Europe. Charlemagne understood that cavalry power depended on superior weapons. At the royal workshops in Aachen and Metz, smiths forged chainmail hauberks from thousands of interlocking iron rings, covering the body from neck to knee. Over the mail they wore red or blue cloaks, symbols of imperial loyalty, and on their heads, conical helmets with face guards of perforated steel. Each knight carried a lance 3 meters long for breaking enemy lines, a two-edged sword, spatha, the emblem of honor and authority, a round shield of oak and leather, with a central iron boss for striking. A Frankish knight, armored and mounted, weighed 3 times as much as a Saxon footman. When hundreds of them charged together, the thunder of hooves and the clash of metal became a weapon of terror. Many enemies fled long before the lances reached them. But Charlemagne did not stop at brute strength. He instilled a new spirit in his cavalry, a creed that made them both soldiers and believers. Each knight swore loyalty not only to the king, but to God and his own honor. They called themselves milites Christi, soldiers of Christ. Before every battle, priests walked through the ranks, sprinkling holy water on swords and lances, while men raised their weapons and shouted together, Deus vult, God wills it. It was faith turned into discipline, and discipline turned into divine fury. A force that fought with conviction as strong as its armor. Charlemagne's cavalry was more than a weapon. It was a strategic instrument. With their speed, his armies could cover hundreds of kilometers in days, appearing suddenly in distant lands. They crossed the snow of the Alps to defeat the Lombards, the frozen Danube to crush the Avars, and the forests and swamps of Saxony to bring the tribes to heel. No other army in Europe could move like them. It was the rebirth of Roman mobility, fused with Christian faith and feudal discipline. Byzantine historians wrote, "The horsemen of King Charles descend from the hills like thunder. The ground shakes beneath their hooves." The Frankish heavy cavalry became the terror of Europe. the first organized heavy force of the Western world, and the model for all who came after, from the Templars to the Teutonic Knights. Charlemagne foresaw the future. He knew that victory would belong not to the brave alone, but to those who could combine engineering, organization, and faith. By merging logistics, armor, and belief, he created the first complete fighting machine of medieval Europe, both powerful and sacred. This was the heart of the superpower army that made Charlemagne's empire possible, an army that commanded the fear of all who faced it and earned its leader the immortal title, the father of Western warfare. Heavy cavalry gave Charlemagne the strike of thunder. But even thunder fades if it has no storm behind it. Charlemagne understood what few rulers ever did, that power is nothing without supply. As Julius Caesar once said, an army marches on its stomach. Charlemagne made that principle the foundation of his empire. He turned logistics into an art, and from that art, he forged the first sustained military superpower of post-Roman Europe. The Frankish realm stretched thousands of kilometers, from the Pyrenees to the Danube, across forests, swamps, and mountains. To control it, Charlemagne built a network of supply lines and depots unseen in Western Europe since Rome. Along the great rivers, the Rhine, the Seine, the Danube, and the Loire, he established military storehouses stocked with wheat, dried meat, wine, and salt. Monks and local officials recorded every sack of grain, every horse, every sword. These were not temples of worship, but of order, each ledger a testament to how faith and administration could coexist in war. The surviving records show that Charlemagne maintained written inventories of food and arms, a system no other Western kingdom possessed in the 8th century. To manage such a vast machine, Charlemagne divided his empire into more than 300 counties. Each was governed by a count, comes, responsible for recruiting soldiers, collecting taxes, and maintaining supply depots. But Charlemagne did not trust power without oversight. He knew too well that authority breeds betrayal. So he created a system unique in medieval history, the Missi Dominici, or envoys of the Lord and the Emperor. These inspectors, always traveling in pairs, one noble and one cleric, rode across the empire, visiting every county and monastery, examining warehouses, soldier rolls, and even the morality of officials. They reported not to local counts, but directly to Charlemagne at his capital in Aachen. Through them, the emperor's eyes watched everything. Every loaf of bread, every coin, every soldier. In this way, Charlemagne achieved what no other medieval ruler could: a military state without internal corruption. Another pillar of his system was industrial organization. At Aachen and Metz, Charlemagne built vast royal armories, where hundreds of blacksmiths, tanners, and carpenters worked year-round. They forged swords, chainmail, helmets, shields, horseshoes, each stamped with regional marks to trace its origin and quality. It was, in essence, the first standardized production system in medieval Europe. Each region maintained subsidiary workshops, connected to the royal armories through a web of river transport. Boats, carts, and horses carried not just weapons, but order, the veins through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. This was Europe's first continuous supply chain. Charlemagne even regulated marching and rest. His troops marched 20 to 25 kilometers a day, stopping at mansions, rest stations built along major roads. There, they could eat, repair armor, and pray. These stations also doubled as communication posts. Messengers could carry dispatches from Aachen to Lombardy's frontier in less than 10 days, making it the fastest information network in Europe. Every major campaign began with a plan written in astonishing detail. Routes, rendezvous points, supply depots, river crossings, the timing of harvests, and even forecasts of seasonal floods. When wars dragged on, Charlemagne built semi-permanent camps near the front, complete with barracks, forges, kitchens, stables, and chapels. He enforced strict regulations: no looting from local civilians, no soldier leaving camp without orders, morning prayers and evening weapon inspections, every day. In his armies, Roman discipline met Christian devotion. But perhaps Charlemagne's greatest innovation was using logistics as a weapon. Against the Avars along the Danube, he didn't attack outright. He built a chain of supply depots along the river, starving the enemy into isolation. It was planned attrition, centuries ahead of its time. Against the Lombards, he divided his army into two columns, one crossing the Alps, the other advancing through the Po Valley. They met at Pavia, encircling the enemy from two fronts, a coordinated operation that only a master of logistics could achieve. Charlemagne was not a battlefield genius like Alexander. He was something rarer, a genius of organization. He didn't need to strike quickly. He simply needed to never strike wrong. In an age when most armies survived on plunder, Charlemagne's forces fed and armed themselves through structure. While his enemies starved and scattered, his soldiers marched, warm and disciplined, through winter snow. And that, more than his lances, more than his swords, was what made the Frankish army the first true military superpower of post-Roman Europe. With supply secured and armor perfected, Charlemagne understood one final truth: that the real strength of an army does not lie in its iron, but in the will of those who wear it. He once said, "An undisciplined army will collapse long before the enemy strikes." And so, Charlemagne turned his Frankish host from a gathering of warriors into a community of order, obedience, and faith, forging not just soldiers, but an army with a soul. Across the empire, he established permanent training camps. There, soldiers practiced year-round, not just before wars. At dawn, they learned to march in formation, each man 3 paces apart, turning and wheeling by the beat of the drum. In the afternoons, they trained with spears, shields, and swords, learning to fight in small groups of 3 or 5, to attack, to cover, to retreat together. At night, they knelt in prayer, listened to priests read from the scriptures, and inscribed their own names onto their blades, a vow of loyalty sealed in steel. No army in 8th century Europe trained like this. Villagers who watched them pass said the same words again and again. They move like a wall made of men. Charlemagne's military discipline extended to every detail. A soldier who arrived late to drill was fined or stripped of his arms. One who dropped his weapon was flogged in public. Any man who broke formation without orders lost his fief and his honor. To Charlemagne, discipline was not cruelty. It was the transformation of fear into respect for order. Only when every man obeyed a single rhythm, he believed, could they defeat enemies 10 times their size. Each spring, Charlemagne held the Great Imperial Assembly, a grand review and combined training of his entire army. Tens of thousands of warriors, cavalry, archers, infantry, gathered on the plains near Mainz or Soissons. Here they drilled, maneuvered, and swore oaths. Charlemagne rode before the ranks on horseback, his lance raised, shouting, "For God and for justice!" The soldiers roared back, their voices rolling like thunder. It was not merely an exercise. It was a ceremony of unity, a ritual that bound men from every corner of the empire into one will, one faith, one purpose. Charlemagne wanted his soldiers not only to fight well, but to understand why they fought. Each army marched with priests who preached of righteousness, mercy, and salvation. Before battle, every man knelt as the priest declared, "He who falls today will be received by the Lord." Then they stood, lifted their lances, and charged as men who believed they had already been forgiven. No other army in Europe possessed such conviction. They feared no death, for they believed their cause was holy. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer and closest advisor, wrote, "When the emperor commanded them to attack, they did not shout. They prayed. And then the storm of iron swept across the field." This was the essence of Charlemagne's host, silent, disciplined, and faithful unto death. They fought not for gold, but for order, and for the belief that they had been chosen by God to bring that order to the world. After every campaign, Charlemagne forbade looting. He decreed, "Victory is meaningless if it shames the name of God." Spoils were distributed by rank. The rest went to the royal treasury or the church. Thus, his men remained warriors, not brigands, and the army kept its sacred dignity. Through iron discipline and unwavering faith, Charlemagne forged an army with a soul of steel. They marched as if in ritual, fought as if in prayer, and died as if entering eternity. It was this spirit that carried the Franks through decades of relentless warfare, from the icy Saxon forests to the deserts of Spain. It was, truly, the iron soul of Charlemagne's army, what later generations would call the birth of the knightly spirit. After forging the soul of his army through faith and discipline, Charlemagne turned his gaze to its weapons. He wanted every Frankish warrior not merely to fight, but to embody power itself. In the royal city of Aachen, he founded imperial armories, where hundreds of blacksmiths, tanners, and carpenters worked day and night, forging the tools of empire: swords, armor, shields, lances, and horseshoes. The Franks had always been skilled in metalwork. Under Charlemagne, that skill became science. Every craftsman was required to mark his work with a personal symbol, so that quality and honesty could be traced. It was the birth of standardized weapon production in Europe. A Frankish soldier's standard equipment consisted of 4 essential weapons. 1. The sword, spatha, a double-edged blade about 90 centimeters long, its core forged by pattern welding, layers of steel folded again and again, giving it both flexibility and deadly sharpness. A Frankish sword could cut through shields and yet resist rust and cold. The emperor's own sword, joyeuse, was said to change color 30 times a day, a symbol of divine light and royal justice. 2. The spear, hasta, over 3 meters long, with a hardened ash or oak shaft. It was the knight's primary weapon in combat, a tool of precision, not rage. In formation, rows of lances created a wall of death. When the front line broke, the second advanced instantly. Discipline turned into geometry. 3. The shield, scutum, round, wide as a man's shoulders, built of layered wood covered in leather, with a raised iron boss at its center, both defense and weapon. Each shield bore the symbol of its region or commander, so that in the chaos of battle, men could still see their comrades. Fjordr. The armor, lorica, a chainmail shirt woven from more than 20,000 iron rings, weighing 12 kilograms, yet light enough to move in. Over it hung a cloak of red or blue, the colors of blood and heaven, symbols of faith and loyalty to the crown. On the battlefield, Charlemagne combined these elements into a calculated art of war. His armies fought in 3 tiers of formation. Front line, the wall of infantry, shield and spear. Middle line, archers and axe throwers, covering the advance. Rear line, heavy cavalry, the hidden storm behind the hills. At the sound of the horn, the horsemen charged downhill, their lances leveled, armor gleaming. The collision shattered enemy ranks before the swords ever struck. It was not just violence, it was architecture in motion. Eyewitnesses described it. When they rode forth, the earth shook and the sky seemed to roar. Charlemagne's method was known later as shock combat, the decisive use of heavy cavalry to break the enemy's core, followed by disciplined infantry to sweep the field. Gone were the chaotic melees of barbarian warfare. This was organized destruction, every movement tied to a drum beat, a trumpet, or a signal flag. It was, in essence, the rebirth of Roman discipline, refined by the faith of Christ. And yet, Charlemagne achieved all this without maps, without radios, without artillery. He relied on timing, vision, and signal. Each morning, commanders met around the emperor's table. He assigned them color-coded banners for the day. 3 waves of a red flag, attack, 2 short blasts of the horn, withdraw. No one spoke in battle. They followed rhythm, sound, and light, a secret language known only to Charlemagne's men. It was the first codified system of battlefield communication in medieval Europe. In major campaigns, Charlemagne revived the lost art of siege warfare, drawing inspiration from Roman and Byzantine engineering. He built mangonels, stone-throwing machines powered by twisted ropes, and battering rams with iron-shod heads hung on chains, pounding fortress gates until they splintered. He ordered the construction of mobile siege towers, rolling fortresses taller than city walls, from which archers could shoot downward at the defenders. At Pavia and along the Danube, his armies stormed fortified cities with precision, proof that Roman engineering had returned to the West. Charlemagne had bridged the ancient and the medieval world. Yet for all his steel, Charlemagne never saw weapons as the final answer. He once told his soldiers, "Steel does not save the soul. Only order and faith preserve peace." So even as he forged thousands of blades, he required his men to pray each night, reminding them that to carry a weapon was a sacred duty, not a privilege. What Charlemagne created was not just an arsenal, but an ecosystem of war, a harmony of metal, mind, and spirit. From his sword, Joyeuse, to his siege towers and armored horsemen, everything reflected his philosophy. But war is not chaos. War is the discipline of order, and through that order, he made his army the symbol of Western strength, a war machine so advanced that Europe would spend the next 1,000 years trying to equal it. He had forged the sword. He had trained the hand that wielded it. He had built the supply lines that fed it. But Charlemagne's true genius lay not in the weapon itself. It lay in the mind that directed it. In an age ruled by chaos, he brought to war the one thing no barbarian king had ever mastered: strategy. Charlemagne was not a reckless warrior. He never trusted fortune or divine chance. Every campaign, large or small, began with a plan etched in detail upon parchment. Routes, rivers, crossings, storage points, seasonal changes. Before a single soldier moved, he convened his commanders around a map, pointing with the hilt of his sword, assigning tasks, supply lines, and rendezvous points. Einhard, his chronicler, wrote, "He did not let war choose him. He chose when to make war and when to win it." Charlemagne's hallmark was a doctrine later called the Triple Principle: 3 movements of mind and army: divide, encircle, unite. 1. Divide. He split his forces into multiple smaller columns, advancing along separate routes to confuse and stretch the enemy. 2. Encircle. Once the foe concentrated on one front, his other columns closed in from the flanks. 3. Unite. At the decisive moment, he gathered every force for one overwhelming strike, often led by his heavy cavalry. It was coordination centuries ahead of its time, a chess master's logic applied to the field of war. When facing superior foes, Charlemagne never sought open battle. He waged wars of attrition and patience. Against the Avars near the Danube, he didn't storm their strongholds. He built a chain of fortresses and granaries along the river, cutting them off from food and reinforcements. As famine and despair weakened them, his cavalry delivered the final blow. Against the Lombards, he launched a double invasion, one army crossing the snowbound Alps, the other moving through the fertile Po Valley. The two forces met at Pavia, trapping the enemy between hammer and anvil. These were not the wars of impulse, they were wars of architecture. On the eve of battle, Charlemagne often stood before his generals, hand resting on the map, sword in the other. He would say, "If we fight as scattered tribes, God will abandon us. But if we fight as one, God will be with us." Then he walked among the camps, speaking to commanders by name, reminding them, "You are not defending land, you are defending order." His presence at the front inspired not just obedience, but faith. The men believed that as long as Charlemagne stood, they could not lose. During battle, his armies moved like extensions of a single will. Orders were transmitted by drums, horns, and colored flags. Each division had mounted couriers, riders who galloped between fronts, delivering messages at astonishing speed. This allowed Charlemagne to coordinate tens of thousands of men over vast distances, centuries before telegraph or radio. From elevated hills, he observed the battle, using fire signals and trumpets to adjust formations in real time. It was the first system of operational command and control in medieval Europe, the ancestor of modern military communication. But Charlemagne's brilliance extended beyond movement and maps. He mastered psychological warfare. Before striking pagan tribes, he sent envoys bearing the cross and a letter. "And submit, and you shall live under God's protection. Resist, and the sword of God will judge you." Many surrendered before the first arrow flew. Charlemagne had discovered that faith itself could conquer. After victory, he built churches and schools in conquered lands, stationed soldiers not to plunder, but to guard. To him, conquest was not destruction. It was the creation of order from chaos. This fusion of warfare and religion made his campaigns unstoppable. Every battle was not just a conflict of men, but a mission sanctified by belief. As later chroniclers wrote, Charlemagne fought with the sword, but he conquered with the conviction that God fought beside him. Looking at the map of Europe in his time, one sees not chaos but design. Each campaign a thread in a vast tapestry of purpose. From Pavia to the Pyrenees, from the Danube to the Elbe, every frontier bore his pattern. Precision, patience, and inevitability. For Charlemagne, war was never madness. It was the deliberate expression of order, the will of a mind that saw farther than any other of his age. He turned Europe into a chessboard, and he, always, was the only one who knew the next move. History remembers Charlemagne as a conqueror, but his true power lay in how he controlled what he conquered. Without maps, without telegraphs, without modern bureaucracy, he managed an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube and kept it in perfect rhythm for nearly half a century. What he created was not chaos held together by fear, but a system of order, a machine of command and control that no ruler before him had imagined. Every campaign began not with swords, but with a written command, the Capitulare Missorum. It was a document of extraordinary detail, specifying who would lead which region, who would supply food, who would care for horses, and who would watch over the morals of the soldiers. Each decree bore Charlemagne's seal in red wax and was carried across the empire by royal couriers, riders who relayed messages day and night, crossing entire kingdoms in mere days. Through this network, Charlemagne could issue orders from Aachen and have them obeyed at the frontiers of Spain or Bavaria, a marvel of communication in the 8th century. In every great campaign, he established what was known as the imperial camp. It was not a mere encampment. It was a moving headquarters. Within its walls, every tent had a purpose. The planning tent, where maps and reports were drawn by candlelight. The information tent, where messengers arrived with dispatches from the front. The chaplain's tent, where priests prayed and chronicled each day's events. At the center stood Charlemagne's own pavilion, marked by the imperial eagle and the cross. There, each evening, his generals gathered. By lamplight, he listened to reports of supplies, casualties, and terrain, until he knew the condition of every wagon, horse, and man. Einhard wrote, he could not sleep unless he knew where each cart, each animal, and each soldier lay. To coordinate such vast forces, Charlemagne developed a system of communication through sound and sight. On the battlefield, orders were carried not by voice but by trumpets, drums, and banners. A single long trumpet blast. Assemble. 2 short blasts. Prepare for attack. 3 short, 1 long, retreat. Banners of red, blue, gold, and white marked different divisions, so that from the hilltop, the emperor could see every movement. At his signal, the banner-bearers on the ridge repeated his flags to the front lines, allowing commands to reach thousands of men at once. It was the first codified communication system in European military history. Charlemagne also understood that power required supervision. He created a double inspection system known as Missi Dominici, envoys of the Lord and the Emperor. Each pair, 1 noble, 1 cleric, was sent to inspect regional commanders, review supplies, and record any misconduct. They could question anyone, even generals, and their reports went only to Charlemagne himself. Through this network, he eliminated corruption, prevented the hoarding of food and gold, and ensured that his vast military machine ran like clockwork. Charlemagne organized his officers into 3 hierarchical tiers of command. 1 dux, regional commander, responsible for strategy and coordination within large territories. 2 comes, count, supervised recruitment, supply, and local defense. 3 vassus or knight led smaller units of 10 to 50 soldiers, enforcing discipline and loyalty. Every rank reported only upward, never across, creating the first true chain of command in medieval Europe. It was a model so efficient that later European monarchies would adopt it almost unchanged. But Charlemagne ruled not through fear, but through example. He lived among his soldiers, ate their food, marched in their ranks. When the Saxon campaign dragged on through icy rivers, he waded through the freezing Elbe alongside them. The men saw not a distant emperor, but a commander who shared their hardships. They called him the king who knew no fear. He led not by command alone, but by presence. Charlemagne understood that an empire could be won by force, but could only be held through discipline and order. He transformed war into a science of administration. Every soldier, every horse, every grain of wheat had its place. And in the heart of that immense structure stood 1 man, the emperor who was both commander and guardian. Because of his system, his army fought without rebellion, marched without chaos, and endured for 40 years, across 2 million square kilometers of Europe. Charlemagne's command system was centuries ahead of its age. It was not born from fear, but from his vision of order as the foundation of civilization. He did not simply rule soldiers. He ruled through discipline, faith, and intelligence. And that, above all else, was why the empire of Charlemagne endured, and why his army became the model for all of Europe's to come. When Charlemagne died in the year 814, his empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. But his greatest legacy was not land. It was the idea of order. He had given Europe something far greater than conquest, a blueprint for power, discipline, and faith. After his death, the empire was divided among his heirs. But the system he created did not fade. It became the foundation for every European kingdom that followed. His model of feudal military service, where lords received land in exchange for providing troops, was copied across France, Germany, Italy, and England. From this model rose a new warrior class, the knights of medieval Europe. They were the spiritual descendants of Charlemagne's cavalry, men who lived by code, faith, and loyalty, bound not just by blood, but by duty. From the 9th to the 14th century, every major European army bore the mark of Charlemagne's reforms. The Norman knights who crossed the Channel to conquer England followed his cavalry doctrine. The Teutonic Knights of the Baltic inherited his discipline and faith. The Crusaders who carried the cross to Jerusalem marched under banners and prayers that echoed his army. In them all, one could still see the reflection of Charlemagne's ideal: organization, faith, and unity of purpose. But his influence extended beyond warfare. He transformed the very concept of a state. He proved that power could be structured, not chaotic, that strength could serve law and justice, not greed. Charlemagne's armies became the model for governance itself, a mirror of how an empire should function. Obedient, efficient, faithful. He taught Europe that war, when guided by faith and discipline, could defend not just territory, but civilization. The chroniclers of the Middle Ages called him Pater Europae, the father of Europe. Not because he ruled it, but because he taught it how to rule itself. Even centuries later, military academies in France and Germany used his capitulary decrees as examples of structure and order. And in the insignia of many modern European cavalry regiments, one can still see the Frankish eagle, the emblem that once flew above his armies. 1,000 years later, when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, he chose to do it in the same place Charlemagne had, in the presence of the Pope, beneath the same Roman arches. He declared, "I do not inherit the throne of kings. I continue the dream of Charlemagne." Even Hitler, centuries later, invoked Charlemagne's name. For every man who dreamed of uniting Europe recognized that he was the first who had done it. Though their purposes differed, they all knew one truth: no one can command Europe without understanding Charlemagne. Through him, the Middle Ages found order. Through his armies, Europe rediscovered unity. He was the bridge between Rome and the modern world. From the armored knights of the Crusades to the organized armies of France, Spain, and Germany, the echo of his discipline endured for 7 centuries. Every drill, every formation, every command structure owed something to the empire he built from chaos. 1,200 years have passed, but the name Charlemagne still carries the weight of empire. He was not only a conqueror, he was an architect of civilization. He proved that strength without order is ruin, that war without purpose is madness, and that true power is built not on conquest, but on discipline, faith, and vision. He did not just wield the sword. He forged the very idea of a European army. And because of that, Charlemagne will forever be remembered as the man who built the first military superpower of post-Roman Europe and the father of Western strength.